So, I mean, these people, they never tried multiculturalism. The English sort of tried it, but the Germans and the French never tried it. What they did was vaguely what I would call Austro-Hungarian. The old Austro-Hungarian Empire model of, you know, pods of people and linked together by the emperor. Who the emperor was in these cases wasn't clear. Well, the emperor was the idea of the Westphalian nation-state, loyalty to the state instead of loyalty to the emperor. And of course, they were surprised to discover after 30 years that it hadn't worked. I remember sitting down with the then president of Germany, a good guy, and his wife, who had been a teacher in one of these areas, and they said, you know, well, we put the, I suppose it was Turks, you know, they went and lived in this area of Berlin, and we left them alone, let them get on with their lives, and now we can't even go in that area. I said, well, that's not multiculturalism. That's abandonment, you know? That's ignorance. That's despair. You let them come to your country, you don't embrace them, and then you say, gosh, they're not integrating. I remember being in a conference in Berlin on this subject, and there were a bunch of Canadians there, and they were just, you know, I don't know, they were all writers, and they were all colors. You know, they came from all over the world, but they were Canadian. And we explained, and at the end, the professor stood up and said, yeah, but you don't understand. We have a real problem here. We have these Islamic women who will not integrate. They stay home. They won't come out. They won't integrate. So I stood up and said, well, that's interesting. Are they citizens? And then he looked at me and said, well, how can they be citizens? They won't integrate. I said, well, how can they integrate if you won't let them be citizens? What generation are they? So, well, they might be second or third generation. So you mean you've got third generation women living in Berlin who are not citizens, and you wonder why they won't integrate? The first thing you do is make them citizens and get them to join political parties and get them involved in volunteer organizations, get them doing whatever. They'll find a way to integrate because it's real life. They're part of the real life of the real society. How they integrate is actually none of your business. It's not the state's business. It's a matter of citizens developing relationships with each other. And it happens quite easily once you embrace people. They want to integrate in some way. And you have to work that out. So that old idea of separating the old citizens and the new citizens, of respecting difference by keeping people apart, that's not multiculturalism. That's laziness. And actually almost, well, it leads to racism. So, what am I saying here? What I'm saying is something very fundamental. Saying something about the state versus the citizen. Remember, part of my topic is writing, the imagination. The state does not have an imagination. The state, no state, is capable of having an imagination. It is not part of the job of the state to have an imagination. In fact, if you think the state has an imagination, you've given up your democracy and your freedom. Because you've actually given over your most essential power to an organization. Something that belongs to you. People have imagination. Citizens have imagination. Now, you may express your imagination, say, through stories of society, of traditions, or whatever, but it's the imagination belongs to not that American-style individualism. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the citizen, the individual, has the ability to imagine and reimagine life. And the role of the writer in all of that, what's our role? Well, our role is really simple. You know, you have to, and professors who teach literature may hate me for this, but anyway, you know, the whole idea that came out of the late 19th century belief in art for art's sake, right, was this sort of idea that writers, painters, we imagine things, that comes out of us, that we are the creative well that produces new ideas. That is so degenerate and self-indulgent. I mean, all we are is, we're sort of like mirrors of society. We're another image. We suck up what society is feeling and thinking. And the great writers are people who have this capacity, the way a great politician does, this capacity to imagine what society is imagining. and to convert that into poetry or novels or plays. That's our strength. Our strength is this kind of metaphysical capacity to go into the well of the collective unconscious and to pull out of it what people are thinking but can't somehow express. So we do indeed have the job, our one job, which is in a way, you know, it looks like our job is to entertain or to upset or to make people enjoy, but our real job is to create language, new ways of expressing emotions and intellectual ideas, which people then use. They use it in their personal lives, they use it in their public lives, they use it in their conversations. And we take old language and we change it somehow, mystically, metaphysically, turn it into new language. That's the magic of the writer. So we're in a way the agents of the imagination. We're not the imagination itself. You're the imagination. And you have to believe that about yourselves, otherwise you're in deep trouble. If you think we're in charge of the imagination, you're in trouble, and so are we, in a funny kind of way. So, is there any water, by the way? If the state doesn't have the capacity to imagine, what does the state do? Or, we know what it does, at best and at worst. It delivers healthcare, it delivers education, periodically it fights a war, it has police who do good things or bad things. But what does the state do as an intellectual organization? Well, the state has memory. The state is based on memory. Well, why? Because memory looks like it's stable, and if you can somehow control the memory, it justifies your actions, right? So most people take power, they're not that ambitious. You know, they're there because they want a job, their father was in politics, they're corrupt, they would like to do a good job, but they don't quite know what to do, so they'll just do what the last person did, continuity. Because of class, you know, their class has always held power. Because of race, their race has always held power, whatever. So this is a very stable view of the way governments use the state and use memory. And of course, in order to justify what they do, memory has to lead to them and to what they are doing. So ambitious governments come in with the principal idea of an ambitious government is to change the memory of the state. Now, it's not necessarily completely dishonest, because of course the memory has many things in it. You know, your memory, I mean, your memory right there, has many things in it. Slovenian, Balkan, Western, Islamic, short-term family, your city, long-term, social justice, racism, egalitarianism and inclusion, exclusion, getting drunk, reading a book. It's all in your memory, right? Everything is there. So, in a way, what an ambitious politician does is exactly what a writer does, which is goes into the collective unconscious of the memory and says, oh, instead of having the memory come from over there, we'll move the memory so it comes from over there. So when things go wrong, it's, you know, they say, oh no, it's all about race. Oh no, it's all about economics. And they can always justify it. You know, this is the problem with the rational idea of proof, which you've been taught. You know, where are your footnotes? Where is your argument based on footnotes? Well, of course, the facts are very malleable. There are thousands of millions of facts. So you just, instead of using those footnotes, you use those footnotes. And it produces a different answer. Novels are the real source of reality. The fiction lies in the social sciences, right? Because the social sciences move around. 10 years they believe this, 10 years they believe that. No one's walked out yet, so I'm still okay. You know, if you actually look at the history of what we teach in the social sciences, what we believed in 1890 isn't what we believe today. What we believed in the 1970s isn't what we believe today, and yet it's all footnoted with facts, truth. So what happened? Well, we changed the direction of the memory, right? And it works for a while. It does some good things, does some bad things. But you think about the 1890s, how many novels you read from the 1890s, 1850s, 1820s, and they're still completely true. And the reason they're still completely true is because they're not based on a belief in the narrowness of memory, a fixed memory. Right? They're based on a kind of openness of the imagination, a real truth. So, ambitious politicians, if you want, they want justice, they'll look back in memory for justice. If they want war, they look back in memory for hatred and war. It's easy to do when you start to understand how this is done. But what we do is say it's much more light on its feet because we don't have to run anything. And our job really is to ensure that people who have power, it could be husbands, could be governments, could be parties, it could be banks, to try and ensure that citizens have access to language which will prevent them from being exploited by a narrow interpretation of memory. I hope that makes sense. And I'll give you an example. I mean, for me, the great modern example, still the greatest modern example, a European example, is, of course, in the 18th century, someone will tell me the date, when there was a big earthquake in Lisbon. Does anyone remember the date? I'm looking to the professors here. The students. Know the date? Was it that early? 1721. Was it that early? God, no, because Voltaire couldn't be 17. But anyway, 17 something. And there's a big earthquake in Lisbon. Do you all know about that? How many people know about that? Please put your hand up and tell me so I know what I'm dealing with. So not many of you know what it is? So it's somewhere in the 18th century, at, if you like, the last act of the old regime, the king's absolute power, the church, enormous power, aristocracy, and so on. Beginning of the modern democratic movement, there was a big earthquake in Lisbon. Thousands of people died, mainly poor people, because it, you know, the worse your house is built, the faster it falls down. So a lot of women and children were killed. And I believe it was a very well-known Jesuit intellectual, that's my memory anyway, responded for the power structure of Western civilization. It was kind of the leading religious intellectual, and the intellectual class was dominated by the church. And he came out and explained that, of course, God was dealing with our sin, and that this was therefore, like Sodom and Gomorrah, like the flood, this was a punishment for sin. Of course, think about it. What did he mean by sin? After all, these were children, these were poor women, these were working class people, peasants. The people who actually did most of the serious sinning were probably living in much more solid houses and less likely to die. Right? So it was your old-fashioned interpretation of guilt. And at that point, this young poet, Voltaire, wrote one poem, not that long, maybe takes 2 minutes to read or so. I haven't read it in a long time, on the Lisbon earthquake, in which he destroys the Jesuit. I mean, he cuts him into tiny little pieces. And in the process of literally torturing him to death with words, he makes such fun of him. He makes him so ridiculous that the whole church looks ridiculous. And because the church looks ridiculous, the monarchs and the aristocrats look ridiculous. The whole power structure of Europe is brought crumbling down intellectually by a single poem written by a young poet who's quite famous but not yet that famous. And it's worth, you should all, I mean, in your classes, it would be fun to just, you can get it on the internet, look it up, read it, and then talk about it. Because it just came at a moment, it was just snapped like that. It was the exact equivalent, if you like, of the young man burning himself to death in Tunisia. It was overnight. Everyone changed their mind. Now, the power structures were enormous, so it took 150 years for it to come falling down. But it started falling right away because people started to imagine very differently. And that's really what writers attempt to do. So where are we today? You know, how do you do the Lisbon earthquake poem of today? What is the Lisbon earthquake? of the day. Well, there are lots of Lisbon earthquakes going on apart from the Japanese one, you know, which is an interesting one, of course, because it's rather like the Lisbon earthquake because of the nuclear power, the corruption of the nuclear industry, the extent to which the Japanese government is armed with the nuclear industry, jobs, money, silence. You saw the latest thing, bringing kids back into school grounds. In order to do that, they had to change the regulations on what was the level of danger from nuclear infection. All fact-based, all good social science work. You know, the proper study was done. The proper proofs were given that it was not dangerous to bring children back into the schoolyards. Classic, modern, technocratic management skills. And of course, nonsense and criminal. But let me just take two examples. One of them is my topic, but just before that, I wrote a book called The Collapse of Globalization, Reinvention of the World. I wrote it about 3 years before the collapse, because I started from 1999 to think the collapse was coming. And so I thought a lot about this area. And what was fascinating about the collapse, whatever, 2-3 years ago, was it produced these enormous levels of debt. Enormous levels of debt. And in the countries which had most accepted the new ideology based on a reinterpretation of memory, the new ideology that speculation was capitalism, that high debt in the private sector was okay but not in the public sector, that whole thing, those countries, Iceland, Ireland, United States, Britain, the four most affected, immediately began to do something unprecedented. They said, well, we can't have the economy collapse because we've already proved to you that the economy is the single most important part of civilization. So in order to save the economy, we're going to transfer private debt caused by they didn't say this, caused by the failure of our philosophy and the failure of private industry. We're going to transfer responsibility for private debt to the public. So for the first time in approximately 6,000 or 8,000 years, private debt was made the responsibility of the citizen. And to some extent it will have affected you directly or indirectly because of Europe. But most blatantly in those four countries, they simply took the failure, the debt levels of the private sector and transferred them into the public sector and made the citizen responsible, both in terms of public debt and in terms of cutting back on public programming. And then in a third, absolutely astonishing step, and see, this is the imagination of the politician using memory. In an astonishing step, they said, well, this is a failure of government and of public policy. And so the direct result of the failure of the private sector speculating is that today they're cutting back on public programming. And that you are being blamed for your incapacity to do what? I'm not sure. So that scam, that fraud, is actually a failure of you and the writers, because we have not managed to make it clear to ourselves the extent to which this is fraud. We have not produced the language, the Voltairean language, which means that when the Secretary of Finance of the United States comes into a room, instead of standing up and hating him but applauding, you actually just burst into hysterical laughter and laugh him out of the room and say he's a complete fool. He's a criminal fool, but he's a complete fool. You haven't done this. No one has done this. And yet what Voltaire did was that, exactly that. That's the power of the imagination. That's the power of language. But we're still taking technocrats and footnotes and the arguments of the last 30 years, we're still taking them seriously as they take away public health care, education, as they put the cost up for education, as they switch money out of public services based on democratic principles of egalitarianism. As they do that, we're not doing anything. We're not doing any of the basic things.